Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett and these are the headlines. Russia says it's renewed strikes on Ukraine's energy facilities a day after Moscow carried out what it calls retaliatory strikes targeting major Ukrainian cities. Russia says it will not turn down a meeting between President Vladimir Putin and US President Joe Biden at the G20 and would consider the proposal if it received one. The Bank of England unveils more measures aimed at calming markets rocked by a UK mini-budget as it warns about the risks to the nation's financial stability. Israel reaches a US brokered agreement with Lebanon to settle a long-disputed maritime border that potentially unlocks significant offshore gas production for both countries. And rights groups voice alarm over an Iranian crackdown on a Kurdish-populated city that has become a hub for protests. Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, is a city on edge a day after Moscow pounded targets there. Russia hit Ukrainian cities with over 80 missiles in total, leaving at least 19 people dead and over 100 injured. As the Tuesday morning rush hour was beginning in Kyiv, air raid sirens sounded again. Commuters on their way to work took shelter in metro stations. The city of Zaporizhia was also hit by 12 C-300 rockets, and Lviv region in western Ukraine witnessed fresh strikes today targeting energy facilities. According to the governor, there have been 3 explosions at 2 energy sites in the Lviv region. President Vladimir Putin has framed the attacks as retaliation for the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, which links Russia to annexed Crimea. And Moscow also accuses the West of escalating the conflict by supporting Ukraine. Later, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will meet G7 leaders on a virtual call and urge an urgent supply of weapons. G7 leaders will discuss what more they can do to support Ukraine. The Biden administration has already promised to provide air defense systems to Ukraine. That's what President Zelensky is currently treating as his #1 priority. The UN General Assembly, meanwhile, is set to hold a vote on whether to condemn the Russian annexation of parts of Ukraine or not. Moscow asked for a secret ballot, but that was rejected. And so either Wednesday or Thursday we'll see a public vote by members on a draft resolution that condemns Russia's referendum votes in those 4 Ukrainian regions. Only 13 countries opposed holding a public vote. 39 countries abstained. The remaining nations, including Russia and China, did not vote at all.
The war in Ukraine should have been never started. But it will end one day. Guns will be silent, but when? At what cost? How many people will have died? How many families separated? How much more suffering endured?
Well, both Ukraine and Russia questioned the United Nations, but for different reasons.
The sham referendums in 4 Ukrainian regions, followed by unlawful decisions by the Russian president and parliament, served this very purpose and thus pose an existential threat to the United Nations and its charter. Ukrainians can tell you what our world will look like if this erosion of the UN's credibility is not stopped.
Такого размаха цинизма, конфронтации и крайне опасной поляризации, как сейчас, не было в истории Всемирной организации. Особенно рельефно это проявляется на данной сессии, политизированность которой вытекает уже из того, что она специально создана для продвижения нарратива, направленного против одного государства – Российской Федерации.
Most Western countries have been vocal in condemning Russia's aggression. In September, Russia held referendum votes in Donetsk, Lugansk and parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia. They all went the Kremlin's way, to no one's surprise. Vladimir Putin then announced the annexation of around 15% of Ukrainian territory. But Russian forces are losing ground in the conflict, including in regions that the country was attempting to annex. The Bank of England has stepped in again with more measures to try and calm markets. The move is in response to soaring UK bond yields. The central bank says it's widening the scope of daily purchases of UK government bonds or gilts until the end of this week. According to the BoE, the latest action will act as a further backstop to restore orderly market conditions. On Monday, the UK government borrowing costs jumped after the bank increased the amount of bonds it was buying before its scheme ends. The BoE hopes the latest action will protect the debt market from dysfunction. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom's unemployment rate has dropped to 3.5% in the 3 months to August. That's the lowest since 1974. However, wages continue to lag behind inflation. On Monday, the British government brought forward the date of key economic forecasts to Halloween, hoping to be able to reassure markets. On October the 31st, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng will unveil debt reduction plans and those independent economic predictions. For more on this, WION's business editor Sumit Chaturvedi joins me live from New Delhi. Sumit, explain to me exactly what the Bank of England is trying to achieve with this latest intervention.
Well, Ollie, these are fresh emergency moves by the Bank of England, and these are new interventions in the bond market specifically. Now, the actions are aimed at bringing calm to markets. Now, $10 billion worth of bonds will be bought in every day. That's the figure according to which BoE will go and buy bonds. BoE also said there are risks to financial stability and the bond yields are soaring. While the pound crashed last week, this all happened when overall the unplanned tax cuts were announced by UK Chancellor, which were rolled back. Bank of England also said this is being done to restore orderly market conditions, and it is widening the scope of daily purchase of bonds. Through bonds, government raises money from investors, and after mini budget, many investors actually in UK began demanding high interest rates, and government borrowing costs then surged. Now, government has assured that pensions are safe. It has also said banks are independent from government and they are bringing stability to markets. So these steps are being taken now, one after the other, to bring stability to the markets, because in the light of growing inflation, growing geopolitical risks like Ukraine and Russia, these steps are important, and UK being at the forefront of this fight against inflation. Winters are coming, the cost for living will increase in UK. All these steps have been now taken to bring the stability to markets, financial stability to markets. That was said by UK today, UK's BoE today. Unemployment, as we said, that it's lowest since 1974, and they are not looking for job increase. Average earning growth are up 5.4%. So that's how overall situation in UK looks like, and that's why these interventions are being made frequently by Bank of England, Central Bank of UK.
Sumit, thank you. And for more, we can also talk to Craig Earlham, Senior Market Analyst at Oanda, who's joining me live from London. Craig, thanks for being with us. Explain the difference in this latest intervention by the Bank of England from the previous round of bond buying that it had already announced.
So the difference is minor. It includes index-linked gilts, so that is tracking inflation. It's also now being extended to a certain extent, not under the initial terms of the programme, but to ensure that pension funds have access to additional liquidity up until the end of the month, when the Chancellor will announce the full budget with the independent OBR forecast. It's effectively just a plumbing issue ultimately for the markets, ensuring ample liquidity. Occasionally we can see dysfunction in markets when you do see shock moves or when you do see shock events, and we've very much seen that over the course of the last couple of weeks, and central banks then intervene in order to try and sustain them. Ordinarily, these shock movements happen on the basis of something unexpected or something that can't be controlled. This has been very much a self-inflicted wound because of the government's determination to announce spending measures without announcing corresponding revenue generation measures or independent forecasts. So these are just intended to tide the UK over effectively until the end of the month and ensure that liquidity remains ample and pension funds remain stable. I expect there'll probably be more tweaks over the course of the coming weeks in order to address issues as they emerge, and the hope then being that after the end of the month, when we do get the full budget, that they won't be necessary. But again, there's a lot of people who are sceptical because of what has been talked about by the government over the course of the last couple of weeks, that the markets simply aren't going to be satisfied with what they come up with later on.
And Craig, why have the moves in the bond market when it comes to the UK created such concern about the pension sector in particular?
So this is to do with products which pension funds use in order to try and manage normal market volatility and also to ensure that their liabilities are met. And these are products which have been used for a very long time and have been relatively stable. But with all products in the markets, there does come risk when you do see extraordinary movements that they will become vulnerable. And this is where we can see central banks step in. We'll remember early in the pandemic, the Fed stepped in on a number of occasions to shore up certain parts of the market in order to ensure ample liquidity and ensure the smooth functioning of financial markets. That's what the Bank of England has been forced to do now in order to stop pension funds becoming unstable. What effectively happened was because the movements that happened to such a degree meant that pension funds were seeing margin calls, and margin calls meant that the pension funds themselves had to come up with additional collateral in order to meet these margin calls. Now, this came initially from selling government bonds, but the problem is when you're selling government bonds on such large scale, then that leads to the price falling and the yields rising, and then that incurs further costs as a result of these liability products, which means that these pension funds have to further sell. This becomes a doom loop in the markets. This means that yields continue to rise because more and more bonds are having to be sold in order to meet those margin requirements, and that is what the central bank sought to diffuse, providing liquidity in the markets, ensuring that yields did not spike as a result of this technical issue, and ensure that fair prices remain. This was initially confused with the kind of bond buying we've seen from central banks around the world over the course of the last 15 years, but the Bank of England has sought to ensure that people do not confuse the two. This is a temporary problem that had materialised in the markets that the Bank of England has sought to buy time for in order to allow it to settle down. This is not bond buying, it's not stimulus, and it's not an attempt to manipulate rates lower. This is a temporary plumbing issue that has been resolved by the Bank of England, and the hope will be that after the end of the month it won't be required anymore.
And Craig, what's your interpretation of that jobs data from the UK? Because the headline seems positive with the rate at a multi-decade low, but it's more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's far more complicated than that. It's an issue that's a phenomenon, really, that is facing much of the world right now. The pandemic led to a lot of job cuts after furlough schemes came to an end. And in the aftermath of that, when the economy bounced back stronger than many anticipated, a lot of these companies found it very difficult to replace those workers and had to spend a lot of time, effort and money in order to hire staff. Even today, we see a report from the CBI that suggested that companies are still complaining about the fact that there is a lack of qualified labour, even at this point in time. What that means now going forward is the Bank of England's job has become that much harder. Companies may be implementing hiring freezes because because of the uncertain environment and the lack of a desire to invest. But what they're not doing very quickly in response to higher interest rates and a more dire economic outlook is letting workers go. Now, no one wants to be let go. Households, I'm sure, will be comforted by the latest jobs report, but it does make the Bank of England's job that much harder. By not letting workers go, that slack that the Bank of England needs to see in the labour market to lead to more sustainable lower wages and lower inflation and less bargaining power ultimately is not appearing. It's going to take a lot longer, it seems, for that to appear, which means the Bank of England may have to work that much harder. So from a household's perspective in the short term, lower unemployment, higher wages is a positive thing, but from the Bank of England's perspective, it makes their job that much more difficult. The other thing that needs to be pointed out from this jobs report is while 6% wage growth, including bonuses, is fundamentally, or appears on the face of it to be fundamentally strong and encouraging, when inflation is running at close to 10%, that's effectively a 4% wage decrease in real terms on an annual basis, and that's why households are continuing to feel the pinch, even if those wage growth numbers look strong on the face of it.
Craig Earlham, thank you.
Thank you.
In the UK, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments on a Scottish independence referendum. It's likely to be weeks, if not months, before a judgment is delivered. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon wants to hold a second Scottish independence referendum in October next year. The Scottish Government believes it can move ahead without Westminster's permission. The UK Government opposes that. In a referendum in 2014, Scots voted 55 to 45% to remain in the United Kingdom, but nationalists argue the vote for Brexit 2 years later changed everything. China's ruling Communist Party is set to reshuffle its leadership. It comes as part of a once-in-5-year Congress set to begin on October the 16th. Xi Jinping is expected to continue for an unprecedented third term in office. However, the fate of other leaders remains up in the air.
President Xi Jinping looks set to secure an unprecedented third term in office, cementing his status as China's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. Xi has been the head of the Communist Party in China's military for a decade. In that time, he has moved China from a tradition of collective leadership to what is now seen as supreme leadership. Let's take a look at how he managed to amass so much control. On entering office in 2012, Xi undertook a sweeping campaign to purge officials deemed disloyal, corrupt, or ineffective. Those that were purged included rivals for power like this man, the popular former Chongqing Party chief Bo Xilai. Xi then built his power base by filling the vacant posts with allies, all the while expanding the state's economic role. As of April this year, 4.7 million officials have been investigated. Xi has also asserted control over party propaganda, telling state media in 2016 that their surname is the Communist Party. Since then, media freedoms have steadily decreased under Xi, while Xi-related propaganda has steadily increased. One of Xi's key moves to amass power came 6 years into his presidency in 2018, when he amended the country's constitution to abolish term limits. There's now no obstacle to the 69-year-old ruling for life. A year before that, he had amended the party constitution to include Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics. Having an eponymous ideology put him on par only with Mao and Deng Xiaoping.
We do not promise to renounce the use of force and reserve the option to use all necessary measures. It is aimed at foreign forces who seek to interfere and the tiny minority of Taiwan independent separatists and their separatist activities.
Xi has tightened control of the military by initiating sweeping reforms and retrenchment from 2015. He has also been increasingly assertive on the world stage, continuing his support for Russia's Vladimir Putin despite the invasion of Ukraine, intensifying pressure to seize Taiwan and asserting control over Hong Kong.
China cannot weaken its quasi-alliance with Putin, with Russia. China doesn't have many friends around the world, and Putin is one of those most trustworthy friends and partners.
Xi's consolidation of power has been seemingly unimpeded by recent challenges, from a stumbling economy to an increasingly out-of-step zero-COVID policy. Official scholars argue a country as big and diverse as China requires a strong central authority, but critics point to China's persistence with policies despite blowback as evidence of the risks of increasingly authoritarian rule.
Japan has scrapped COVID border controls after 2 years of pandemic isolation in the hope of reviving the country's struggling tourism sector.
After 2 years of pandemic isolation, Japan is finally opening its doors to visitors. However, hopes for a tourism boom face an uphill battle with a lack of hospitality workers and bolted shut shops. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is banking on tourism to help stimulate the economy and reap some benefits from the yen slide to a 24-year low. Aratasawa is among those keen for the return of foreign tourists, who used to make up nearly 90% of the guests at his inn.
People from abroad will be able to come here as independent tourists from the 11th. I'm hoping and anticipating that a lot of foreigners will come to Japan, just like how it was before COVID. When the COVID pandemic started, the kind of guests that Soenoya had been receiving, individual travellers, were suddenly unable to enter Japan. So, up until now, we've basically been in a situation where we've had 0 visitors. So in the beginning, there were many days with 0 guests.
A mere 500,000 people have come to Japan so far this year, stark in comparison to the whopping 32 million in 2019. Spending from tourists will only reach around 2 trillion yen, that's $13 billion, by 2023 and won't exceed pre-COVID levels until 2025, according to a report by the Nomura Research Institute. British inn guest Jenny Owen hopes foreign travellers will respect Japan's mask-on etiquette.
I worry for Japan in that way, and I hope that people can come here and be respectful about the measures that Japan are putting on in, whether it seems like the right measure to us or not. We have to respect it and do what they say.
Flag carrier Japan Airlines has seen inbound bookings triple since the border easing announcement.
The Sri Lankan cabinet has approved a proposal to downgrade the country's status from a middle-income country to a low-income country. The cabinet spokesperson says Sri Lankan GDP is expected to decline further and that the step was being taken to unlock more financial support from international institutions.
In order for ease of financial support and intervention by international organizations. Therefore, the cabinet paper presented for Sri Lanka to be classified as a low-income country received cabinet approval.
However, shortly afterwards, that cabinet approval, the director of the Sri Lankan president's external affairs tweeted a clarification. Dinuk Kolumbaj says the South Asian nation will remain a middle-income country, but called for the World Bank to grant Sri Lanka eligibility to obtain International Development Association loans. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Do stay tuned to WION. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
There are many other